In the late summer of 1945, as the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the port of London was strangely quiet. Victory banners still hung from buildings blackened by years of bombing, but the docks told a different story. Warehouses were empty, ships waited without cargo. Clerks shuffled papers under dim lights, calculating figures that refused to add up. Britain had won the war, yet, in those ledgers, something far more important was slipping away. Not land, not soldiers, but power itself. At that moment, no declaration was made. No treaty announced the end of an empire. No enemy marched through the capital. And yet, within a few short years, the currency that had once ruled global trade would quietly lose its throne. The British Empire would not fall with a crash. It would fade, replaced by something far more subtle: the dollar. To understand how this happened, we need to step back before the victory parades, before the post-war optimism, and into the financial machinery that had powered Britain's rise for more than a century. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British pound sterling was the backbone of the global economy. International trade contracts were written in sterling. Central banks held it as a reserve. Shipping insurance, commodity prices, and long-term loans flowed through London. Britain's imperial reach was reinforced not just by ships and soldiers, but by trust in its currency. Sterling was stability. Sterling was order. London sat at the center of a vast financial web. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, colonial economies were tied to the pound. Local currencies were pegged to it. Trade surpluses were recycled through British banks. Even independent countries preferred sterling accounts because the system worked at least as long as Britain could guarantee it. But that system depended on one critical assumption: that Britain would always be able to pay its way. The First World War cracked that assumption. Britain emerged victorious, but deeply in debt. Gold reserves were drained. Loans from across the Atlantic became unavoidable. The pound survived, but only by clinging to its pre-war status through political will rather than economic reality. When Britain attempted to restore the old gold standard in the 1922, it did so at a rate that overvalued sterling and strained the economy. Unemployment rose. Exports suffered. The empire held together, but under stress. Then came the Second World War. This time, the financial damage was far worse. Britain did not simply fight a long war, it paid for one. For 6 years, the country imported food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials at a scale it could not sustain. Gold reserves were shipped overseas. Overseas investments were sold off. Foreign assets accumulated over generations were quietly liquidated to keep the war effort alive. By 1941, Britain was effectively broke. Survival now depended on external support. Massive wartime assistance arrived from across the Atlantic, keeping factories running and ships sailing. But this support came with consequences that were not fully visible at the time. What mattered was not just that Britain survived the war, but how it survived it. When peace finally arrived, the illusion of imperial strength quickly collided with economic reality. Britain faced enormous debts, devastated infrastructure, and a population exhausted by years of rationing. Export industries lagged behind competitors. Dollar reserves were dangerously low, and the global economy was reorganizing itself at speed. This was the first major turning point. The world that emerged after 1945 was not the world Britain had once dominated. The old imperial trading system, built around sterling and preference agreements, no longer aligned with the priorities of a global economy focused on growth, reconstruction, and free-flowing capital. New financial institutions were shaping the rules. New markets were opening. And at the center of it all stood a currency backed by unmatched industrial strength and vast reserves. The United States had not just escaped the war unbroken. It had grown richer because of it. Its factories had expanded. Its gold holdings had increased dramatically. Its financial system was stable, liquid, and trusted. As countries rebuilt their economies, they needed dollars to import machinery, food, and fuel. They needed access to American markets. Slowly but decisively, global trade began to orbit around a new center. Britain tried to resist this shift. Policymakers in London worked to preserve sterling's international role. They maintained the so-called sterling area, encouraging former colonies and allies to keep their reserves in pounds. Controls were imposed to protect dwindling dollar balances. The empire, now fraying at the edges, was asked to keep financing the center. But the pressure was relentless. Every crisis exposed the same weakness. Britain could not earn enough dollars to sustain its commitments. Each attempt to defend sterling drained reserves further. Each delay made the adjustment more painful. Confidence, once sterling's greatest asset, began to erode. And as confidence faded, power followed. What happened next was not a single event, but a process. Quiet, technical, often hidden behind complex agreements and financial language. Yet its consequences would be profound. By the time the world fully recognized the shift, the transformation was already complete. In the next part, we will see how post-war deals, financial dependencies, and mounting pressure accelerated the rise of the dollar and pushed Britain closer to a reckoning it could no longer avoid. By the late 1942s, Britain's position in the world economy had become increasingly fragile. On paper, it was still a victor. In reality, it was running out of options. The war had ended, but the financial emergency had not. Each month, Britain imported more than it exported. Each month, its scarce reserves of dollars slipped lower. And each month, the global system moved further away from sterling and closer to something Britain could not control. The first shock came sooner than expected. In 1947, Britain attempted a bold gamble. Controls on the pound were relaxed, allowing it to become freely convertible into dollars. The idea was simple: restore confidence, revive trade, and prove that sterling could still function as a global currency. The result was catastrophic. Almost immediately, holders of pounds rushed to exchange them for dollars. Within weeks, Britain's dollar reserves were bleeding away at an unsustainable rate. The experiment was abandoned in panic. What this episode revealed was devastating. Sterling was no longer trusted, not by markets, not by governments, and increasingly, not even by Britain's closest partners. The empire that had once stabilized global trade could no longer stabilize its own currency. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Across the Atlantic, financial planners viewed the situation with a different lens. A stable global economy required a reliable anchor. Sterling, weakened by debt and political obligation, could no longer fill that role. The dollar could, but only if countries accepted a new set of rules that favored open markets, currency discipline, and financial transparency. For Britain, this posed an impossible dilemma. To defend sterling, it needed controls, imperial preference, and the loyalty of its overseas territories. To access dollars, it needed to liberalize trade and accept external oversight. Each path undermined the other, and there was no longer enough power to dictate terms. This tension intensified as decolonization accelerated. One by one, territories that had once been forced to hold sterling balances began to seek independence not just politically, but financially. Reserves were converted. Trade patterns shifted. London's ability to rely on imperial surpluses diminished year after year. The second major turning point arrived in the form of repeated financial crises. Sterling came under attack again and again. Each time, Britain scrambled to defend its exchange rate through emergency measures. Interest rates were raised. Imports were restricted. Spending was cut. These were not strategic choices. They were reactions, short-term fixes to buy time. But time was running out. At the same moment, a new international architecture was solidifying. Global institutions designed to manage currency stability and provide emergency support were becoming central to economic life. Their influence rested on one reality: access to dollars. And access to dollars came with conditions. Britain now faced the very situation it had once imposed on others. To stabilize its economy, it needed outside support. To receive that support, it had to accept limits on its sovereignty. Decisions that once would have been made in London were now shaped by negotiations abroad. Spending priorities, exchange rate policies, and even social programs came under scrutiny. The loss was not immediate, but it was unmistakable. As the 1,950 seconds progressed, the gap between Britain's global ambitions and its financial capacity widened. Maintaining overseas military bases, defending distant trade routes, and projecting power all required resources Britain no longer had. Each commitment drained reserves. Each withdrawal signaled decline. Meanwhile, the dollar's role expanded effortlessly. Oil contracts were priced in dollars. International loans were issued in dollars. Central banks rebuilt their reserves in dollars. What had once been a multipolar currency system narrowed into something far more concentrated. The world was not forced to adopt the dollar. It did so because it worked, and because the alternative no longer did. For Britain, the consequences were deeply political. Successive governments promised renewal while quietly managing retreat. Publicly, the language of global leadership remained. Privately, financial reality dictated restraint. The empire, once justified as an economic necessity, became an unaffordable burden. The final illusion that Britain could remain a great power through financial skill alone was beginning to collapse. And yet, the most decisive moment had not yet arrived. It would come later, in a crisis that exposed just how completely control had shifted. A moment when Britain would be forced to confront, openly, that the age of sterling was over, and that survival now depended on acceptance of a new order. In the next part, we will reach that breaking point. The moment when economic pressure, political pride, and global finance collided, and Britain's remaining autonomy was put to the ultimate test. The breaking point arrived not with a declaration, but with a collapse of confidence. By the mid-1960 seconds, Britain was trapped in a familiar cycle. Growth lagged behind its rivals, exports struggled to compete, imports surged ahead, and every imbalance pushed the pound closer to crisis. Sterling was still officially one of the world's major currencies, but in practice, it survived only through constant defense. That defense was becoming impossible. International investors watched Britain's numbers closely. Trade deficits widened. Government spending rose. Reserves fell. Each signal fed the same conclusion. The pound was overvalued. And once that belief took hold, markets moved faster than governments ever could. Speculation intensified. Money flowed out of sterling. Central banks hesitated to hold it. Emergency loans were arranged, not to strengthen Britain's economy, but to delay the inevitable. Behind closed doors, officials debated options that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Devaluation was no longer taboo. It was looming. For years, Britain had resisted it at all costs. Devaluation meant admission of weakness. It meant that savings would shrink, imports would become more expensive, and international prestige would suffer a public blow. More than that, it meant surrendering the last illusion that sterling still anchored the global system. But reality was relentless. In 1967, the decision could no longer be postponed. Britain announced a sharp devaluation of the pound. Overnight, its value dropped dramatically against the dollar. The announcement was framed as a technical adjustment. The effect was psychological shock. Sterling's credibility collapsed. For foreign governments, this was confirmation of what they already suspected. Britain could no longer guarantee the stability required of a reserve currency. Central banks accelerated the shift away from sterling holdings. Trade contracts were rewritten. Financial planning moved decisively into a dollar-centered world. The empire's financial backbone snapped. What followed was not recovery, but dependency. Each crisis now required external support. Each support package came with conditions. Fiscal restraint replaced autonomy. Monetary policy narrowed. Britain's economic choices became constrained by the need to reassure lenders abroad. This was the quiet cost of lost power. The most striking aspect was who benefited. American financial institutions expanded their global reach. Dollar markets deepened. U.S. influence within international financial bodies grew stronger with every rescue operation. This was not conquest. It was alignment on terms Britain could no longer set. Meanwhile, the British public felt the consequences directly. Prices rose, wages lagged, governments promised stability through discipline. Austerity entered political language not as ideology, but as necessity. Decisions were framed as unavoidable responses to forces beyond national control. And in many ways, they were. The final betrayal was not imposed from outside. It was internal acceptance. Britain adjusted its ambitions downward. Military withdrawals accelerated. Overseas commitments were abandoned. The country that had once shaped global finance now reacted to it. By the early 1972s, sterling's role was largely symbolic. The dollar was dominant not because it was declared so, but because every alternative had failed. Britain's long struggle to preserve financial independence ended not with defiance, but with resignation. The collapse was complete. Yet one moment still remained, one that would make this dependence explicit. A crisis so severe that Britain would have no choice but to formally submit to external oversight. Not as an empire managing decline, but as a nation seeking permission to stabilize itself. In the final part, we will examine that moment and the lasting legacy it created. How the transition from sterling to dollar dominance reshaped not only Britain's economy, but the rules of global power that still govern the world today. The final reckoning came quietly. In 1976, Britain did not face invasion. Its cities were intact. Its institutions still functioned. Yet behind the calm surface, the country was again running out of options. Inflation was high. Growth was weak. The pound was under sustained pressure. International confidence, already fragile, after decades of decline, was evaporating. This time, there was no illusion left to protect. Britain turned outward for help, not as a leader shaping the system, but as a participant bound by it. Negotiations began with international financial authorities whose influence rested squarely on dollar power. The message was clear. Stability would be provided, but only under strict conditions. Spending cuts, fiscal discipline, limits on economic autonomy. Britain accepted them. The agreement was framed as technical necessity, but symbolically, it marked the end of an era. For the first time since the rise of sterling, Britain openly acknowledged that it could not stabilize its economy on its own terms. Survival now depended on compliance with a dollar-centered financial order. This was the moment when the transition became irreversible. The pound did not disappear. It continued to circulate, to trade, to function. But it no longer defined the system. Its role was regional, not global. Decisions that once would have rippled outward from London now flowed inward from a broader financial architecture dominated by the dollar. What made this shift so profound was its subtlety. There were no ceremonies announcing the end of monetary leadership, no formal declarations of surrender. The empire did not fall with the lowering of flags, but with balance sheets, exchange rates, and conditions written into agreements few citizens ever read. Yet the consequences were everywhere. Global trade consolidated around the dollar. Energy markets priced in it. Debt contracts relied on it. Central banks built reserves with it. The architecture of power adjusted accordingly. Countries that controlled dollar liquidity gained influence. Those that depended on it lost room to maneuver. Britain adapted, but the adaptation came at a cost. Economic policy became cautious. Ambition narrowed. Governments learned to govern within limits set by external confidence rather than internal preference. Austerity was no longer episodic. It became structural. This legacy extended far beyond Britain. The transition from sterling to dollar dominance reshaped global power itself. It demonstrated that influence in the modern world flowed less from territory and more from financial architecture. Control over currency, credit, and settlement mattered more than colonies or fleets. The United States did not replace Britain through conquest. It replaced it through capacity. The dollar succeeded because it was backed by production, stability, and scale at a moment when Britain could no longer offer those things. The shift was accepted not because it was forced, but because it worked. That is the most important lesson of this story. Empires no longer end only on battlefields. They fade through systems that outgrow them. Power moves toward reliability, liquidity, and trust. And when those qualities shift, influence follows even if no one announces it. Britain's experience shows how difficult it is to recognize decline when it arrives dressed as adjustment. Each decision seemed temporary. Each compromise justified. Each retreat framed as responsibility. Taken together, they marked a transformation. By the end of the 20th century, the world Britain had once organized around its currency no longer existed. A new order had taken its place, one defined by dollar flows, financial institutions, and rules written to suit a different center of gravity. And yet, this was not a story of sudden collapse. It was a story of quiet replacement. The dollar did not overthrow the British Empire. It rendered it unnecessary. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that still defines global politics today. Real power lies not in symbols of dominance, but in the systems that others depend on and cannot easily escape. That is how the dollar quietly replaced the British Empire.